The Kray twins were English criminals, the foremost perpetrators of organized crime in the East End of London from the late 1950s to 1967. With their gang known as the Firm, the Krays were involved in murder, armed robbery, arson, protection rackets and assaults. Ronald and Reginald Kray, better known as Ronnie and Reggie, were born on the 24th of October 1933 in Haggerston, East London, to Charles David Kray, a wardrobe dealer, and Violet Annie Lee. Their father was of Irish descent and their mother was Romany. The brothers were twins, with Reggie born 10 minutes before Ronnie. Their parents already had a 6-year-old son Charles James, and a sister Violet died in infancy. When the twins were 3 years old, they contracted diphtheria. Reggie recovered well, but Ronnie however was close to death, and doctors in the hospital kept him away from his mother and Reggie. Violet soon walked into the hospital and told the doctors she would take him home, and that the only thing he needed was for her to nurse him, and to have his twin brother near him. After she took him back to Steen Street in Hoxton, she laid him next to Reggie and Ronnie's health dramatically improved, and within 3 or 4 days, he was back to normal. It is claimed that this illness as a newborn would later have a profound effect on Ronnie, who in his adolescence, developed mental health issues. The Kray family moved from Steen Street in Haggerston to 178 Valence Road in Bethnal Green. During the Second World War, the twins were evacuated to East House in Hadley, Suffolk, with their mother Violet and their older brother Charles. They stayed at East House with the owners Dr. and Mrs. Style, for about 1 year before moving back to London, as Violet missed her friends and family. While they were in Hadley, the twins attended Bridge Street Boys' School. The influence of their maternal grandfather Jimmy Cannonball Lee caused the brothers to take up amateur boxing, then a popular pastime for working-class boys in the East End. Sibling rivalry spurred them on, and both achieved some success. The Krays were called up to do national service in the British Army in March 1952. Although the pair reported to the depot of the Royal Fusiliers at the Tower of London, they attempted to leave after only a few minutes. When the corporal in charge tried to stop them, he was seriously injured by Ronnie, who punched him on the jaw. The Krays walked back to their East End home, and they were arrested the next morning by the police and turned over to the army. In September, while absent without leave again, they assaulted a police constable who tried to arrest them. They became among the last prisoners to be held at the Tower of London, before being transferred to Shepton Mallet Military Prison in Somerset, for a month to await court-martial. After they were convicted, both were sent to the Buffs Home Counties Brigade Depot Jail in Canterbury, Kent. However, when it became clear they were both to be dishonorably discharged from the army, the Krays' behavior became worse. They dominated the exercise areas outside their one-man cells, threw tantrums, emptied a latrine bucket over a sergeant, dumped a canteen full of hot tea on another guard, handcuffed a guard to their prison bars with a pair of stolen cuffs and set their bedding on fire. Eventually they were moved to a communal cell where they assaulted the guard with a vase and escaped. After being quickly recaptured, they spent their last night in military custody in Canterbury drinking cider, eating crisps and smoking cigarillos courtesy of the young national servicemen acting as the guards. The next day the Krays were transferred to a civilian prison to serve sentences for the crimes they committed while AWOL. Their criminal records and dishonorable discharges from the Royal Fusiliers ended their boxing careers, and the brothers turned to crime full-time. They bought a run-down snooker club in Mile End where they started several protection rackets. By the end of the 1950s, the Krays were working for J. Murray from Liverpool and were involved in hijacking, armed robbery and arson, through which they acquired other clubs and properties. In 1960, Ronnie Kray was imprisoned for 18 months for running a protection racket and related threats. While Ronnie was in prison, Peter Rackman, head of a landlord operation, sold Reggie a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn, to ward off threats of further extortion. The location is where the Berkeley Hotel now stands. This increased the Krays' influence in the West End by making them celebrities as well as criminals. The Kray twins adopted a norm according to which anyone who failed to show due respect would be severely punished. Both Ronnie and Reggie notoriously laundered money through dog and horse tracks as well as through businesses, which led to several others being investigated during the mid-1960s for their cooperation with the crimes. They were assisted by a banker named Alan Cooper, who wanted protection against the Kray's rivals the Richardsons, based in South London. Ronnie was known to be very intimidating, although he would usually be sedated on strong doses of Stemetal. His almost Jekyll and Hyde mood swings would instill fear into members of the firm. His violence was ruthless and somewhat sadistic, whereas Reggie's was reasoned and level-headed. Ronnie's behavior would flip within minutes, and he would become erratic and hellbent on getting what he wanted. In the 1960s, the Kray brothers were widely seen as prosperous and charming celebrity nightclub owners and were part of the swinging London scene. A large part of their fame was due to the non-criminal activities as popular figures on the celebrity circuit, being photographed by David Bailey on more than one occasion and socializing with lords, MPs, socialites and show business characters, including George Raft, Frank Sinatra, Peter Sellers, Judy Garland, Diana Dawes, Shirley Bassey, Liza Minnelli, Cliff Richard, Jane Mansfield, Danny LaRue and Barbara Windsor. The Krays also came to public attention in July 1964, when an expose in the tabloid newspaper Sunday Mirror insinuated that Ronnie had conceived a sexual relationship with Lord Boothby, a conservative politician, at a time when sex between men was still a criminal offence in the UK. Although no names were printed in the piece, the twins threatened the journalists involved, and Boothby threatened to sue the newspaper with the help of Labour Party leader Harold Wilson's solicitor Arnold Goodman, as Wilson wanted to protect the reputation of Labour Member of Parliament Tom Dryburgh, a relatively open gay man known to associate with both Boothby and Ronnie Kray, just weeks ahead of a pending general election which Labour was hoping to win. In the face of this, the newspaper backed down, sacking its editor, printing an apology and paying Boothby £40,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Because of this, other newspapers were unwilling to expose the Krays' connections and criminal activities. Much later Channel 4 established the truth of the allegations, and released a documentary on the subject called The Gangster and the Pervert Peer in 2009. The police investigated the Krays on several occasions, but the brothers' reputation for violence made witnesses afraid to testify. There was also a problem for both main political parties. The Conservative Party was unwilling to press the police to end the Krays' power, for fear that the Boothby connection would again be publicized, and the Labour Party in power from October 1964, but with a wafer-thin majority in the House of Commons, and the prospect of another general election needing to be called in the very near future, did not want Dryburgh's connections to Ronnie Kray, and his sexual orientation, to get into the public realm. Reggie married Frances Shay in 1965, but Reggie's marriage to Frances only lasted 8 months when she left, and committed suicide. The marriage was never formally dissolved. An inquest came to the conclusion that she had committed suicide, but in 2002 an ex-lover of Reggie came forward to allege that Frances was murdered by a jealous Ronnie. Bradley Allardyce spent 3 years in Maidstone prison with Reggie and explained, "I was sitting in my cell with Reg, and it was one of those nights where we turned the lights down low, and put some nice music on, and sometimes he would reminisce. He would get really deep and open up to me. He suddenly broke down and said, 'I'm going to tell you something I've only ever told 2 people and something I've carried around with me, something that had been a black hole since the day he found out.' He put his head on my shoulder and told me Ronnie killed Frances." He told Reggie what he had done 2 days after. On the 9th of March 1966, Ronnie shot and killed George Cornell, a member of a rival South London gang, the Richardson Gang, at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. The day before, there had been a shootout at Mr. Smith's, a nightclub in Catford, involving the Richardson Gang and Richard Hart, an associate of the Krays, who was shot dead. This public shootout led to the arrest of nearly all the Richardson Gang. Cornell, by chance, was not present at the club during the shootout and was not arrested. After visiting the hospital to check up on his friends, he randomly chose to visit the Blind Beggar pub, only a mile away from where the Krays lived. Ronnie was drinking in another pub when he learned of Cornell's whereabouts. He went there with his driver Scotch Jack John Dixon, and his assistant Ian Barry. Ronnie went into the pub with Barry, walked straight to Cornell and shot him in the head in public view. Barry, confused by what happened, fired 5 shots in the air, warning the public not to report what had happened to the police. Just before he was shot, Cornell remarked, "Well, look who's here." He died at 3:30 a.m. in hospital. Ronnie was already suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the killing. According to some sources, Ronnie killed Cornell because Cornell referred to him as a fat puff, a derogatory term for gay men, during a confrontation between the Krays and the Richardson gang at the Astor Club on Christmas Day 1965. Richardson gang member, Mad Frankie Fraser, was tried for the murder of Richard Hart at Mr. Smith's, but was found not guilty. Richardson gang member Ray the Belgian Cullinane testified that he saw Cornell kicking Hart. Witnesses would not cooperate with the police in the murder case due to intimidation, and the trial ended inconclusively without pointing to any suspect in particular. On the 12th of December 1966, the Krays helped Frank Mitchell the Mad Axeman to escape from Dartmoor prison. Ronnie had befriended Mitchell while they served time together in Wandsworth prison. Mitchell felt that the authorities should review his case for parole, so Ronnie thought that he would be doing him a favor by getting him out of Dartmoor, highlighting his case in the media and forcing the authorities to act. Once Mitchell was out of Dartmoor, the Krays held him at a friend's flat in Barking Road, East Ham. He was a large man with a mental disorder, and he was difficult to control. He disappeared, but the Krays were acquitted of his murder. Freddie Foreman, a friend of the Krays, claimed in his autobiography Respect, that he shot Mitchell dead as a favor to the twins and disposed of his body at sea. The Krays' criminal activities remained hidden behind both their celebrity status and seemingly legitimate businesses. Reggie was allegedly encouraged by his brother in October 1967, 4 months after the suicide of his wife Frances, to kill Jack the Hat McVitie, a minor member of the Kray gang who had failed to fulfill a £1,000 contract, £500 of which had been paid to him in advance, to kill their financial advisor Leslie Payne. McVitie was lured to a basement flat in Evering Road, Stoke Newington, on the pretense of a party. Upon entering the premises, he saw Ronnie Kray seated in the front room. Ronnie approached, letting loose a barrage of verbal abuse and cutting McVitie below his eye with a piece of broken glass. It is believed that an argument then broke out between the twins and McVitie. As the argument got more heated, Reggie pointed a handgun at McVitie's head and pulled the trigger twice, but the gun failed to discharge. McVitie was then held in a bear hug by the twins' cousin Ronnie Hart, and Reggie was handed a carving knife. He then stabbed McVitie in the face and stomach, driving the blade into his neck while twisting the knife, not stopping even as McVitie lay on the floor dying. Reggie had committed a very public murder, against someone who many members of the firm felt did not deserve to die. In an interview in 2000, Freddie Foreman revealed that McVitie had a reputation for leaving carnage behind him due to his habitual consumption of drugs and heavy drinking, and his having threatened to harm the twins and their family. Tony and Chris Lambrianou and Ronnie Bender helped clear up the evidence of this crime, and attempted to assist in the disposal of the body. With McVitie's body being too big to fit in the boot of the car, the body was wrapped in an eiderdown and put in the back seat of a car. Tony Lambrianou drove the car with the body, and Chris Lambrianou and Bender followed behind. Crossing the Blackhall Tunnel, Chris lost Tony's car and spent up to 15 minutes looking around Rotherhithe area. They found Tony, outside St. Mary's Church, where he had run out of fuel, McVitie's body still inside the car. The body was left in the car and the three gangsters returned home. Bender then went on to phone Charlie Kray informing them that it had been dealt with. When the Krays heard where they had left McVitie's corpse, the twins were livid, and desperately phoned Foreman, who was then running a pub in Southwark, to see if he could dispose of the body. With dawn breaking, Foreman found the car, broke into it and drove the body to Newhaven, where with the help of a trawlerman, the body was bound with chicken wire and dumped in the English Channel. This event started turning many people against the Krays, and some were prepared to testify to Scotland Yard as to what had happened, fearing that what happened to McVitie could easily happen to them. Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reid of Scotland Yard was promoted to the murder squad, and his first assignment was to bring down the Kray twins. During the first half of 1964, Reid had been investigating their activities, but publicity and official denials of Ron's relationship with Boothby made the evidence that he collected useless. Reid went after the twins again in 1967, but frequently came up against the East End wall of silence, which discouraged anyone from providing information to the police. They were represented in court by Namone Lethbridge. By the end of 1967, Reed had built up enough evidence against the Krays. Witness statements incriminated them, as did other evidence, but none made a convincing case on any one charge. Early in 1968, the Krays employed Alan Bruce Cooper, who sent Paul Elvey to Glasgow to buy explosives for a car bomb. Elvey was the radio engineer who put Radio Such on the air in 1964, later renamed Radio City. After police detained him in Scotland, he confessed to being involved in 3 murder attempts. The evidence was weakened by Cooper, who claimed that he was an agent for the U.S. Treasury Department investigating links between the American Mafia and the Kray gang. The botched murders were his attempt to put the blame on the Krays. Cooper was being employed as a source by one of Reed's superior officers, and Reed tried using him as a trap for the Krays, but they avoided him. Eventually, Scotland Yard decided to arrest the Krays on the evidence already collected, in the hope that other witnesses would be forthcoming once the Krays were in custody. On the 8th of May 1968, the Krays and 15 other members of the firm were arrested. Exceptional measures were used to stop collusion between the accused. Nipper Reed then secretly interviewed each of the arrested and offered each member of the firm a deal, if they testified against the others. Whilst in prison, the Krays had come up with a plan, which included having Scotch Jack Dixon confess to the murder of Cornell, Ronnie Hart to take the McVitie murder, and Albert Donahue to stand for Mitchell. Donahue told the twins directly that he was not prepared to be cajoled into pleading guilty, to the anger of the twins. He then informed Reed via his mother that he was ready to cooperate. Reed set up another secret interview, and Donahue was the first to tell the police everything that he knew. Ronnie Hart had initially not been arrested, and was not a name initially sought after by the police. With Donahue's testimony, Hart was arrested. Offering the same terms as the others, Hart then told Reed everything that had happened during McVitie's murder, although he did not know anything about what happened to the body. This was the first time that the police knew exactly who was involved and offered him a solid case to prosecute the twins for McVitie's murder. Although Reed knew for certain that Ronnie Kray had murdered George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub, no one had been prepared to testify against the twins out of fear. Upon finding out the twins intended to cajole him, Scotch Jack Dixon also turned in everything he knew about Cornell's murder. Although not a witness to the murder, he was an accessory, having driven Ronnie Kray and Ian Barry to the pub. The police still needed a witness to the murder. They managed to track down the barmaid who was working in the pub at the time of the murder, gave her a secret identity, and she testified to seeing Ronnie kill Cornell. Frank Mitchell's escape and disappearance were much harder to obtain evidence for, since the majority of those arrested were not involved with his planned escape and disappearance. Reed decided to proceed with the case and have a separate trial for Mitchell once the twins had been convicted. The twins' defense under their counsel John Platts Mills, QC, consisted of flat denials of all charges and discrediting witnesses by pointing out their criminal past. Justice Melford Stevenson said, "In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities." It was the longest murder hearing in the history of British criminal justice, during which Justice Melford Stevenson stated of the sentences, should not be less than 30 years. In March 1969, the Kray twins were sentenced to life imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 30 years for the murders of Cornell and McVitie. Their brother Charlie was imprisoned for 10 years for his part in the murders. There was a long-running campaign, with some minor celebrity support, to have the twins released from prison, but successive Home Secretaries vetoed the idea, largely on the grounds that both Kray's prison records were marred by violence toward other inmates. The campaign gathered momentum after the release of a film based on their lives called The Krays in 1990. Produced by Ray Burdiss, it starred Spandau Ballet brothers Martin and Gary Kemp, who played the roles of Reggie and Ronnie respectively. Ronnie, Reggie, and Charlie Kray received £255,000 for the film. Reggie wrote, "I seem to have walked a double path most of my life. Perhaps an extra step in one of those directions might have seen me celebrated rather than notorious." Ronnie and Reggie were allowed under a large police guard to attend the funeral service of their mother Violet on the 11th of August 1982, following her death from cancer a week earlier. They were not allowed to attend her burial in the Kray family plot at Chingford Mount Cemetery. The funeral was attended by celebrities including Diana Dawes, and underworld figures known to the Krays. To avoid the publicity that had surrounded their mother's funeral, the twins did not ask for permission to attend their father's funeral in March 1983. Ronnie was a Category A prisoner, denied almost all liberties and not allowed to mix with other prisoners. He was eventually certified insane, his paranoid schizophrenia being tempered with constant medication. In 1979 he was committed and lived the remainder of his life in Broadmoor Hospital in Crowthorne, Berkshire. Reggie, who was constantly being refused parole, was locked up in Maidstone Prison for 8 years, Category B. In 1997, he was transferred to the Category C Wayland Prison in Norfolk. In 1985, officials at Broadmoor Hospital discovered a business card of Ronnie's that led to evidence that the twins from separate institutions were operating Kray Enterprises, a lucrative bodyguard and protection business for Hollywood stars, together with their older brother Charlie Kray and an accomplice at large. Among their clients was Frank Sinatra, who hired 18 bodyguards from Kray Enterprises on his visit to the 1985 Wimbledon Championships. Documents released under Freedom of Information laws revealed that although officials were concerned about this operation, they believed that there was no legal basis to shut it down. In his book My Story, and a comment to writer Robin McGibbon on the Kray tapes, Ronnie stated, "I'm bisexual, not homosexual." In the 1960s, he also planned to marry a woman named Monica whom he had dated for nearly 3 years. He called her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. This is mentioned in Reggie's book Born Fighter. Also, extracts are mentioned in Ron's own book My Story, and in Kate Kree's book Sorted Murder, Madness and Marriage, and Free at Last. Ronnie was arrested before he had the chance to marry Monica, and even though she married Ronnie's ex-boyfriend, 59 letters were sent to her between May and December 1968 when he was imprisoned, show Ronnie still had feelings for her and his love for her was very clear. He referred to her as my little angel, and my little doll. She also still had feelings for Ronnie. These letters were auctioned in 2010. A letter Ronnie sent to his mother Violet from prison in 1968 also refers to Monica. It says, "If they let me see Monica and put me with Reg, I could not ask for more." He went on to say, "Monica is the only girl I have liked in my life. She is a lovely little person, as you know. When you see her, tell her I am in love with her more than ever." Ronnie subsequently married twice, marrying Elaine Mildener in 1985 at Broadmoor Chapel, before the couple divorced in 1989, following which he married Kate Howard, whom he divorced in 1994. Kate Howard lived for a number of years in Headcorn, Kent, in Forge Lane. In an interview with author John Pearson, Ronnie indicated he identified with the 19th century soldier Charles George Gordon. Ronnie stated, "Gordon was like me, homosexual, and he met his death like a man. When it's time for me to go, I hope I do the same." Ronnie died on the 17th of March 1995 at the age of 61, at Wexham Park Hospital in Slough, Berkshire. He had suffered a heart attack at Broadmoor Hospital 2 days earlier. Reggie was allowed out of prison in handcuffs to attend the funeral. Charlie Kray, Ronnie and Reggie's older brother, was released from prison in 1975, after serving 7 years of his 10-year sentence for his role in the gangland crimes. Charlie was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment in 1997 for conspiracy to smuggle cocaine, in an undercover drug sting. He died in prison of natural causes on the 4th of April 2000 aged 72, with Reggie allowed out of prison to attend his older brother's funeral. Reggie died in his sleep on the 1st of October 2000 at the age of 66 during his incarceration. Reggie became a born-again Christian. He was freed from Wayland on the 26th of August 2000 on compassionate grounds, on the direction of Home Secretary Jack Straw, following the diagnosis of cancer. He had been diagnosed with bladder cancer earlier that year, and the illness had been declared as terminal. The final weeks of his life were spent with his wife of 3 years, Roberta, in a suite at the Townhouse Hotel at Norwich, after he left the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital on the 22nd of September 2000. 10 days after his death he was buried beside his brother Ronnie, in Chingford Mount Cemetery. During the funeral, crowds of thousands lined up to applaud. Thanks for watching. For more videos please click like and subscribe.